Hi Owen, can you summarise what Forces Watch is and what it does?
Yes, Forces Watch is a small organisation based in London that does three main things. It was set up in 2010, and basically we look at the military, the armed forces in the UK, and how they interact with society. In the first instance, this is about the age of recruitment in the UK into the armed forces, which is currently 16 as the minimum age, which is unique in the European Union. We're one of very few countries around the world that do this, and we advocate for that age, that minimum age of recruitment, to be raised from 16 to 18. The second of our three main areas of work is to do with the military's involvement in education. So for many years now, the armed forces have had a significant presence and influence in schools, colleges and universities, and this is actually growing at the moment for various reasons, and we raise questions about it because we know that recruitment and providing a positive impression of the military for young people are the two main reasons for this work being done, and we think that's a problem. And the third area of our work is to do with the military's engagement with society more broadly, something that's often referred to as militarisation or militarism. So things in local authorities, in public spaces, in media, that are encouraging the public in general to feel that the military is acceptable, completely normal, something that we can't do without, and something that's beyond criticism. And that has a big impact in terms of international politics. My personal focus at Forces Watch is on the military's involvement in education in the UK. And one example of a project I'm working on at the moment is a film that we've recently produced, which gets teenagers in the UK, a few teenagers, to talk about what they think about this engagement that the military enacts with young people. Because up until now there's been a lot of really useful critiques of it and questions raised about it. Is it mainly for recruitment? Is it acceptable that it seems to happen more in more deprived areas than less deprived areas? Things like this. But there's little that's come from young people themselves, so we wanted to give them a voice and hear their range of views. And this film looks especially at the cadets, the Army Cadets, Sea Cadets, Air Cadets and combined cadet force units in schools, and gets young people on the one hand who criticise it and who have a big problem with the cadets because they see that recruitment and giving a positive impression of the military are the two main sort of drivers behind the cadets, and on the other hand there were cadets themselves who defended the cadets and talked about the opportunities they had received from the cadets, but also a lot of kind of illuminating points come across from the film, and it really is there to encourage debate and get young people realising that this is a controversial issue, not something that they should just accept without thinking about it. The support for the armed forces is so high at the moment in the UK for a few different reasons. Partly it's come from very concerted, deliberate policy from the government in the last 6 or so years, which basically was a response to the lack of understanding and lack of support, as they saw it, from the public for the armed forces at a time when we were fighting 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in a time which we were spending masses of taxpayers' money on those wars and needed more recruits. And they said, we just don't have enough support and awareness from the general public. We need to introduce things like Armed Forces Day, we need to expand cadets in state schools, we need to create community covenants where local authorities put on initiatives to support their local armed forces, lots of different things. And that has had an impact, I'm sure. I think also the way that the media is represented, the military is represented in the media, charities such as Help for Heroes, there's a whole kind of swathe of initiatives that have sprung up that have contributed to this sentiment. Although historically as well the armed forces have been very popular, so it's really an increase. But the interesting thing is that the wars themselves have been very unpopular. So there's this dichotomy where on the one hand support for the armed forces is very high, but the wars are very unpopular. And I think there's a very genuine, deliberate effort from the military and from the government to increase that public support to make the wars more palatable, more acceptable. But interestingly, sometimes this backfires, because if you make the armed forces really popular, you make the individuals very kind of respected, and so when they're dying, that's not popular, so it can actually make the wars even less popular.
We don't have conscription or compulsory military service in Britain now. Everyone's free to choose whether they want to be in the armed forces or not, so what's all the fuss about, really?
So we don't have conscription in the formal sense. It's not obligatory to join the armed forces, but I think it's, I hesitate to use the word volunteer armed forces because there are always other factors. It's never a clear, sort of clean choice. Obviously poverty is a major one, lack of opportunity. It still remains the case that the majority of people joining the armed forces at 16 are men who have low qualifications. They're almost all joining the army, almost all of them are joining the infantry, and it's those that are most exposed to the high trauma fighting that can lead most likely to death, long-term mental health problems and serious injuries.
Youth cadet groups are very popular, you mentioned just now, and provide exciting activities for many young people, teach them important practical skills and teamwork and keep them out of trouble. Is there anything wrong with this? What would be better for them?
Yes, there are problems with the cadets. As you say, they do offer exciting opportunities to young people, and there's a catch with that. There's a reason that the government spend a lot of money, although it is being cut, but disproportionately to other youth services, and they remain state funded by the MOD. The Ministry of Defence. There are problems because, again, it's part of the military's youth engagement work, and in fact it's the biggest part, it's the main focus of it. And the two main outcomes of that youth engagement, as they state very clearly in their documents, are recruitment into the armed forces of young people and providing a positive impression to those young people so that when they grow up they will be favourable towards the military. The cadets, for example, might let you end up flying a plane if you're in the air cadets. They might let you do rifle training. All of this stuff is clearly designed to give young people both a positive impression of the armed forces for themselves and potentially to lead them to join the armed forces. If you look at the combined cadet force units, which are the ones that are placed permanently in schools, those are being expanded at the moment in state schools, which is a novelty. And this is actually coming from the Department for Education in what they call the Military Ethos in Schools programme. And that is a new development that concerns us a lot, because if these are focused, these new state school cadet units are focused on schools in poorer areas, which they are, and that's stated very clearly, often new academies or converted academies, there's a likelihood that there is going to be a recruitment kind of corridor there created for young people, just at the time, incidentally or not, that the armed forces are really struggling to recruit. They're doing this massive restructuring. The army have cut many jobs, and in turn, or in exchange, they're trying to recruit lots of reservists, so part-time soldiers, and they're absolutely failing at that. They haven't succeeded at all to meet their targets. So I really suspect, we strongly suspect, that the expansion of the cadets is part of their attempts to kind of right that imbalance and get more recruits.
But I mean, many people are proud of our armed forces, even if they don't agree with what the government sends them to do. Wouldn't you agree that they're an important part of our tradition and what's made Britain great?
I think the debate about whether kind of we should be proud of the armed forces, whether we should support them, whether we need them, is a huge one. Forces Watch focus on critical thinking, basically. So we're not saying we shouldn't have a military. We're saying that if we have a military, it should be one that is far more equitable, so that people aren't joining because they have no other opportunity. It should be one that is devoid of things like sexual harassment, bullying, and so on, which is still rife, both of them, in the armed forces. And it should be one that really is about moving towards genuine peacekeeping and peacemaking. So as long as the state prioritises the armed forces above other institutions and cuts them only disproportionately compared to other state organisations, there's a big problem, because we've got our priorities completely wrong. We aren't really kind of benefiting individual people. The people that tragically die in the wars tend to be the youngest recruits, often from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. That is a tragedy, because the wars are not in their interest. And of course that's not even talking about the people suffering at the other end, which, as we know, throughout the last 100 years or so, have been increasingly civilians. So very few combatants actually get killed nowadays. It's much more civilians. We would certainly be very critical of what is, we feel, an uncritical sense of pride in the armed forces, where things like Armed Forces Day and Remembrance Sunday almost celebrate armed forces. Glorify is a word that's often overused by people who are critical of the military, but I think it's useful actually on occasion. If you looked at last Remembrance Sunday, you had music performances with poppies falling from the stage as if it was a festival. That is not remembrance. Remembrance was about lamenting the terrible loss of the First World War, as the film very strongly shows. And then we think about Armed Forces Day, a new initiative which is about getting public support and recognition for the armed forces to help recruitment and taxpayer sort of acquiescence towards the funding for the military. And that again is very celebratory, and it completely trivializes war, where you have kids playing with guns and getting shown how to drive a jeep or how to sit in a tank. And I just think this greatly sad, really, that is the approach the public have been kind of encouraged to take. And many people do it not because they're stupid or ignorant or anything like that, it's because they haven't been encouraged to look at another point of view. And that is what we're trying to redress slightly, is that huge imbalance where from a very young age we are given exposure to the military that's only positive, and it's so powerful because it comes through the media, it comes through education and so on, that it's actually quite hard to step out of that. And I'm lucky from my experiences that I've been encouraged to think differently to that. And again, it links back to conscientious objection, this idea of actually saying, no, I don't think this is right, and I'm going to stand strong with this. And I'll certainly listen to the other points of view, but I have very strong convictions for peace, or for an alternative point of view that is really benefiting people in a bigger way. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
This word militarism, which you've used several times, what does it actually mean? Isn't it more of an old-fashioned idea that you read in history books? Does it affect us in our day-to-day lives nowadays?
Yes, militarism absolutely affects us in our day-to-day lives. It's a word that's been around for a long time, but I think, if anything, it's very, very pertinent to the current situation in the UK. What we mean by militarism is where the military or military approaches are prioritised, privileged, above other approaches to conflict in particular, or problems. So, for example, when you have ill discipline or perceived ill discipline in schools, militarism in schools would therefore advocate for introducing ex-military people as teachers, for having a stricter discipline, perhaps introducing a cadet unit, and that's saying that the problem is discipline, the solution is a military approach. The military approach is one of strictness, is one of obedience, is one of hierarchy, etc. Militarism also strongly suggests that the military is an essential part of life. It's completely normal, we can't do without the military. And it's quite hard to almost envisage a world without the military because of that. But what the trickle-down effect of that is that when the military is, as it is being in the UK at the moment, made more visible and more influential in different areas of life, like education, like in public space, in publicity, advertising, etc., people are encouraged to kind of accept it. They don't think to criticise it, because to criticise it is so strongly discouraged from a young age, with things like armed forces visits to schools, adverts on the television, the omnipresence of the military at public ceremonies, anything to do with the royal family, who are obviously strongly linked, always have been, at big public occasions, like sporting occasions, and this is just growing, and the impact of that is that we are militarised. We are led to think in a very sort of uncritical way about the military, and the long-term impact of that is quite possibly that wars are more likely to occur, or more likely to be accepted as inevitable, as necessary, and the funding priority from the state is towards the military. People in government, in the Ministry of Defence, often talk about our first priority is to protect the nation, and security is understood in a very narrow sense in this country, or around the world generally, which is one of military security. So security is being stronger militarily than other powers and being able to defeat them, rather than genuine security, which is about peace, which is about equal access to resources, which is about good relationships from a personal to an international level.
How do you think all the attention on the centenary of World War I has affected people's attitudes to the military and war in general? Are we learning anything from it? Is there too much emphasis on the horrors and blunders and not enough on respect for sacrifice and celebration of bravery?
I think the current way that the centenary is envisaged to be commemorated is not as bad as it could have been, in the sense that I don't think there's much glorification of the armed forces then or now. I think the majority of people do recognise that it was a terrible event. Many people say that it was avoidable, and many people fortunately are aware of things like the fact that 250,000 minors, boys under the age of 18 who shouldn't have been in the army, were in the army, and many of them died. And you know, people are aware of some of those terrible tragedies, and that's really important. So that can feed into a kind of critical thinking today about the military. On the other hand, you do have the inevitable and very problematic influence of the military today within those commemorations. For example, one thing I discovered recently at a talk by the army in London was that they were pushing to get a soldier on every coach of school children that was going to the trenches in France. So what was, in my opinion, actually quite a positive move by the government, which was to fund pupils from every school to go to the battlefields to get a sense of, hopefully, of the scale and the loss, and be kind of in situ in that sense, could now be really hijacked actually by having a soldier from today who were involved in completely different conflicts, completely different wars, completely different context on that coach, potentially linking it to their own experience, potentially promoting the armed forces today, even careers in the armed forces. So there is unfortunately very questionable influences of the military today, and what it means is that it's quite possible that some people will come out of these 4 years with a more positive impression of the military, rather than a greater lament and sense of what a terrible thing that happened. So I think it's really important that there are initiatives that are presenting both the kind of lesser known tragedies of the First World War and also the resistance of the First World War, and likewise who are questioning the more kind of celebratory or linking to today's armed forces initiatives today.
Is there anything more, do you think, that Quakers should be doing or saying about it all at this point, in view, you know, about the commemorations and the centenary?
I'd like to answer this question kind of in two parts. So first of all, from Forces Watch's point of view, we are incredibly grateful towards the Quakers and respectful of the Quakers in Britain, partly because they're very supportive of our work. We often share resources and ideas with the Quakers in London at their headquarters, and a lot of our funding comes from Quaker trusts, because Quakers have this historic commitment to questioning the military, to pacifism in some cases. So we are very appreciative of the Quakers' work, both historically and now, in challenging militarism and things like the age of recruitment, advocating for that to be raised in the armed forces. In terms of what we would like to see Quakers doing around the centenary of the First World War, we're very glad that they're producing lots of resources for young people, especially young Quakers, but I think that will also be accessible to non-Quakers, because for us, young people are at the heart of militarism. They are the main targets of recruitment, they're the main targets of initiatives to get people thinking positively about the armed forces, because they will grow up to be the decision makers, the voters, etc. of tomorrow. So we think it's great that the Quakers are producing those youth resources. From a personal point of view, as a Quaker myself, I think that initiatives like producing resources both for Quakers and other people who aren't Quakers, that recognise Quakers' role in the First World War, the disproportionate number of conscientious objectors were Quakers. Many of the supporters of those conscientious objectors, or people who were challenging the war, criticising it in other ways, were also Quakers or linked to Quakers. I think those stories are really important to get out there because they are inspiring. They're ones of people who stood up against a majority, often, you know, putting themselves in a very uncomfortable position, and said, I don't think this is right, and I'm going to stick to that, even if it means being imprisoned, even if it means being stigmatised and insulted and kind of isolated by other people in society. So I think Quakers really have a role there to kind of offer that alternative point of view, and they've done so already in kind of newspaper articles and other resources that they're producing.
Technology and communication have completely changed the way wars are fought since World War One. How have they changed the way we think and feel about war, if they have?
Yeah, military technology has changed a lot since the First World War. It's got more sophisticated, and by sophisticated I mean it's better at killing people, or allowing the military to kill people, which is kind of essentially the main function of the military, and people often kind of forget that and say, when you question the military, oh no, but think about, you know, the great work they do in terms of Coast Guard work or responses to emergencies, and yes, they do that, but that's not by any means their primary purpose. And in fact, it's very convenient that they have the funding and equipment to sometimes be able to help out in those situations. Actually, civilian, non-military service would do it much better because they could focus on it. Anyway, military technology, I think probably at this point you have to mention drones, because that is the kind of particularly current and concerning and controversial military technology that for Forces Watch is very interesting and concerning. Interesting because as we rely more heavily on drones to carry out the military's job, which is essentially killing the enemy or the perceived enemy, there is less use of frontline soldiers, probably, and that could mean that recruitment is less focused on the youngest, most disadvantaged people in society, and actually becomes more focused on technically skilled people. So for us there's a question, will it change the recruitment kind of landscape? Currently it hasn't, because despite cuts to the armed forces, things like the infantry remain intact, and those are the ones where most of the youngest recruits and most of the most disadvantaged recruits go. So in a way it currently hasn't changed that much, but it could do, and it links very closely into another of our concerns, which is the kind of militarization through games, and particularly video games, of children from a very young age who are exposed to all sorts of video games, some of which have the military's involvement in their development. The military also use these to recruit. There was a Start Thinking Soldier campaign a few years ago which did that directly. You watched the advert on TV, then you played the game online, and you were encouraged to join up. And the military also use video games in their training, and a lot of the kind of studies of drones, critical studies, highlight this fact that it is very similar to some video games.
Is the world safer now than it was in 1914?
Is the world safer now than it was in 1914? That's a big question. I think it depends for whom we're talking about. Certainly for civilians, I think in terms of wars, the world is less safe. I think since the First World War, increasingly it's been far more civilians that have died, and a far higher proportion of civilians that have been killed in wars than combatants, whereas in the First World War it's the other way around. So in that sense, the world is not safer. Some people say that, we're constantly progressing in some ways, medicine's getting better, wars are happening less frequently, perhaps economies are getting more equal, but I'm very sceptical of a lot of that. There's still so much injustice, and all of that leads to things like less safety. So for example, if you are from an economically deprived area in the UK, you're more likely to be recruited into the armed forces because you're less likely to have other job opportunities, you're less likely to have the qualifications that might let you do an alternative or follow an alternative path in life. And that leads directly to danger, because it's those people that are most exposed to the worst risks of the armed forces, such as being killed because of the
wouldn't you say that sort of looking at nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, for example, that they've been the main things that have prevented another world war?
We would be very sceptical of the idea of a nuclear deterrent, and certainly personally I dispute the idea that it can be a deterrent. I think it can only create the possibility of nuclear war. And we know that, for example, the UK's security reviews in recent years have highlighted things like climate change as the major threat or major potential cause of future war, and dwindling resources such as water. Not nuclear states that might attack us, and it would only be against nuclear states that those weapons could possibly be used. And there's no such thing as being able to use nuclear weapons against terrorists, and yet the recent wars have all been talking about terrorist threats. So very sceptical of nuclear weapons and whether they provide any sort of security or peacefulness.
Is it human nature to follow the crowd? What does it take to stand up against popular opinion?
I don't think it's human nature to follow the crowd. I actually think it's human nature to have a gut instinct on something, which is often critical of violence, of war, of killing, and so on. We actually are naturally against killing. Human beings have an inhibition towards killing, whereby it requires very rigorous training by the military to get someone to be able to kill someone on order or in the moment. And it used to be historically that the statistics showed that discharging of weapons was often off target, so people were deliberately missing their targets, whereas now that's much lower because they're trained to such a point that they are essentially brainwashed into killing. I think what prevents us from standing against the crowd often is fear, and that's very natural. It might be fear that we are going to be ostracised, we're going to be kind of isolated by people for not supporting the armed forces, for example, or it might be actual physical fear. You know, people have been beaten up or worse for their strong stances, ones which are actually for non-violence and peace. So I can really empathise with people who have a gut instinct that no, this isn't right, but do end up going along with the crowd in a quiet way, in a very conflicted way, because of fear.
Is there anything you can say about the inspiration that we can draw from the example of the stories of conscientious objectors in World War One, and is there anything else you want to say about what you do?
I think the main inspiration we can take today from the stories of the conscientious objectors during the First World War is that one of being convinced and following your conviction to the point that you put yourself in a very vulnerable position, which is one of perhaps being in a minority, going against the majority, but staying true to your innermost beliefs, which are very, very powerful. And I think that is incredible. It takes a hell of a lot of bravery. I think the idea that these people were treated as cowards and called cowards is incredible, because they were anything but cowards, which isn't to discredit the people who did fight, because that took another form of bravery. But it was an amazing thing to do, and I take inspiration for that, because whilst I don't have to gladly refuse to do military service, compulsory military service, I am, I think, a conscientious objector in other ways, as are many people, be it my criticism of military recruitment, my scepticism of support for the armed forces and parades and so on that celebrate them, be it the way that I favour locally grown food over kind of far shipped in supermarket food. These are all kind of things that from a conscience, from a place inside, that happens through conversations and quiet reflection and thinking, become something very powerful and something that can sustain you.